She was a gorgeous debutante with the world on a string.
She's a beautiful woman in the prime of her life. She really had no enemies.
Her family was well respected, as was she.
Until it was all suddenly taken away.
It was bad, you know. Beautiful entranceway to a beautiful townhome, and there she's laying covered in blood and roses.
This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit.
The investigation would take detectives from a quiet bedroom community in Atlanta to the mansions of Palm Beach, Florida, to expose a killer desperate to be part of high society.
There's old money down there in Palm Beach. It's the rich and the famous.
I remember going to parties where there were bowls of cocaine.
When you have a lot of money, you can buy your way out of a lot of different things.
Friday, January 16th, 1987. It's a quiet morning in Atlanta's exclusive Buckhead neighborhood when shots ring out along a row of townhouses.
The police were called, and they responded almost immediately.
Officers arrived to find the door of one of the homes left open. Inside the foyer is the body of a 35-year-old woman. She's been shot twice in the head at point-blank range.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of blood.
Shootings are uncommon in this upscale community, but police are even more surprised when the victim is identified as socialite Lita McClinton Sullivan.
Lita was such a sweet woman. She was very attractive, tall, beautiful smile, and very warm and very caring.
It really made no sense. She lived in a very nice part of town. She was doing all the right things as a human. She was a great human being. Why would someone want this beautiful woman in the prime of her life who was good to everyone? Why would they want him dead?
Born January 7th, 1952, Lita McClinton grew up among Atlanta's social elite.
She came from a very well-to-do family. Her mother was a state representative, and her father worked for the Federal Department of Transportation. Very upscale, white-collar people. And they lived in an old section of Atlanta, DeKalb County, Georgia. She attended college in the Atlanta area. I believe it was Spelman College.
She did go through debutante training and was a debutante and was a very elegant, beautiful, well-educated woman.
As a socialite, the next logical step was to find a suitable husband. But instead, Lita focused on building a career in fashion.
She just loved the retail business and fashion. And I think her aspiration was to run her own store one day. She was so busy that she was not dating. I never met anybody. Maybe she was just quiet about it and very private.
That all changed the day 34-year-old James Sullivan walked into her life in 1975.
Jim Sullivan was from the Boston area of Massachusetts. He grew up kind of scrappy and hard, for lack of a better term. But he inherited a great deal of money when his uncle died and left him a few liquor stores. The liquor store business drew him to Macon, Georgia, and eventually from Macon, he made his way to Atlanta, which is how he ended up meeting Lita.
Throughout that time period, he became friendly with a lot of the Atlanta socialites.
And he charmed her, evidently, in the store, and they started to date, and she was kind of head over heels.
According to Lita's friends, despite the 11-year difference in age, it was a classic case of opposites attract.
He had money, but was a little rough around the edges and came from Boston, which couldn't be more different than Atlanta, Georgia, especially during that time frame.
He was a terrible dresser, and I know that Lita changed that by just suggesting his ways. He was also very thrifty, so it was a hard job, but she got it done.
She loved that man, and there was something about him that appealed to her. Maybe it was the difference that drew her to him, but there's no logical explanation behind it. But I think the love between her and him was real.
After dating for only a year, Lita and Jim got married in 1976, settling into his house in Macon together. But Jim wanted more for himself and his new bride. He was a social climber who had his sights set on the exclusive island enclave of Palm Beach, Florida.
It's a very influential, very affluent area of Florida. It has lots of money, a lot of socialites.
And Jim had already found the perfect place. Casa Isleta, a historic beachside villa just down the road from Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort.
When Jim bought that big house, everybody noticed. And everybody wants to know who bought that house because it's right on South Ocean Boulevard. It's a beautiful Italian house. Lita thought that she could be very happy. I mean, what's not to love about beautiful homes? And it's a pretty place. I remember their first party where Alan and I were invited. The invitation came in a big piece of chocolate, hand-delivered, with the invitation, with the address and all that. He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. It was his coming out party.
Around the same time, the couple bought a new townhouse in Atlanta. And for nearly a decade, the couple would split their time between Palm Beach and Buckhead.
She's an Atlanta girl through and through, so Lita wanted to come back home.
They bought a townhouse maybe a mile from where I lived, so I saw her often. But that was Lita's home base, and they went back and forth to Florida.
It seemed as though Lita was getting the best of both worlds, thanks to her husband.
I remember he bought her a Bentley, and I remember Lita would drive it, and then we would all jump in, and it was really a lot of fun. We'd go down Peachtree riding, like 6 of us all riding in this convertible. It was really fun.
She was happy, frequently seeing her family again and her friends, and was enjoying everything that life had for her at age 35.
But when Lita answered her doorbell that January morning, it all came to a bloody end. Now she lies dead in the foyer of her Midtown getaway, and investigators want to know why.
She wasn't a high-risk victim. She didn't do anything that would cause her to become a victim of a violent crime, such as this.
The first thing you ask yourself is, why is this person dead? Who wants this person dead? What is this murder all about?
Coming up, Lita's loved ones say her marriage wasn't everything it appeared to be.
When people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper.
"35-year-old socialite Lita Sullivan has been murdered at her townhouse in Buckhead. Given its high-profile nature, the Atlanta Police Department puts its most decorated detectives on the case.
The lead detective was Welcome Harris, who was himself an icon of the civil rights movement and a very talented homicide detective and also a native Atlantan, who was one of the lead detectives on the Atlanta missing and murdered children's cases.
Early analysis of the crime scene indicates this isn't an attempted robbery, but an orchestrated murder.
There was a box of roses in the foyer near 2 spent 9mm shell casings and a big pool of Lita's blood.
It wasn't a burglary. The person didn't come in and ransack the house afterwards. The person came to the door. When she looked, it was just flowers that she could see. She opened the door, and he shot her, point blank.
And so good morning was the last thing that Lita ever said. This was a hit. This was an orchestrated hit. She was lured to the door with flowers so that she could be shot in the head.
One of Lita's neighbors says he heard the gunshots, and when he looked outside, he caught a glimpse of the possible shooter.
There was a flower delivery individual. That individual shot and killed Miss Sullivan and thereafter fled the area.
He was able to give a general description to the Atlanta Police Department, and they were able to do a composite sketch.
But if this was a professional hit, who sent the gunman? And why? Detectives' first call is to Lita's husband, Jim Sullivan.
James Sullivan was in Palm Beach, Florida, at Casa Lita when Lita was murdered.
He is shocked by the news and says he couldn't imagine who could ever want to hurt her. But Lita's devastated parents tell police there were plenty of people who wished her harm. In fact, that's one of the reasons why she'd gotten the house in Buckhead to begin with.
When Lita moved to Palm Beach, it was in the middle of the 80s, of 1980s. Palm Beach was a very white Anglo-Saxon place. If you go to some of the big parties, there are no black people.
The only time you see people of color are the landscape people and the butlers and things like that. It's an island full of mansions, and it's very exclusive.
She was having a hard time. She told me quite a few times that people were rude to her when she walked into a store. They were sort of surprised, like, who are you? And why are you here? Lita was not happy in Palm Beach. She felt like she wasn't treated, so she kept on coming back to Atlanta.
However, Lita's parents say that what concerned them most was the way James had handled the discrimination. When Lita told him she was unhappy, he didn't seem to care.
Like, what'd you bring me here for? I can feel it, I can sense it. I'm not welcome here. This isn't my world.
He didn't worry about Lita. He didn't listen that when people knocked on the door, they thought that she was the housekeeper. He didn't care about that.
On Palm Beach, they kind of excluded her from all the other things that were going on in Palm Beach, and he wanted to become a force in Palm Beach.
He wanted to impress people in Palm Beach. He wanted to take Palm Beach by storm.
I don't think that James Sullivan was welcomed as much as he probably wanted to be. He was trying to work his way into that, and I don't know if that worked out as well as he wanted.
Now you got two strikes against you. You're a white guy who's not blue blood money, you're more blue collar money, and you're married to an African American woman.
Lita's loved ones say that his behavior confirmed what they already suspected about the marriage.
There was tension in between James and his wife. We had received the same information that she had left and come back to the Atlanta area.
She didn't share a lot, but you could tell sometimes that she was by the sound of her voice, or when she'd call and say, let's get together. It was a hard time for her.
And it seems there was another reason for the split as well.
It would get back to me that he would be having lunch with some other woman at the Ritz-Carlton.
Lita Sullivan caught him having an affair, was sleeping with somebody in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. He would embarrass her. She was ridiculed for being a black woman in Palm Beach, and that was the last straw. That's when she moved back to Atlanta.
When Jim started attending parties by himself, Lita had already made the decision that she was not staying.
Coming up, could Lita's murder be connected to her impending divorce?
The divorce was coming, but she hadn't yet dealt and told everybody. I mean, people knew, but it was a hard time for her.
Detectives investigating the murder of Lita Sullivan have a promising lead. It seems her marriage to millionaire James Sullivan was in trouble, after she'd discovered he'd been cheating on her.
Palm Beach was where their relationship began to dissolve.
We invited him and Lita over for a small party we were having, and Lita and I were in the library, and Jim was in the living room, and he was asking another guest who was there to go out on a date with him. I think he just thought he could get away with anything.
The police soon discovered that infidelity is only one of James' many flaws.
I learned from her mother that, that they didn't like Jim Sullivan from the beginning. That there's just something about him.
I personally thought he was a phony, and he was a big talker and a big show-off.
I don't know of anybody that was close to him, or if he had any really close friends. Well, other than the women that he ran around with. He was very fond of prostitutes, and he did his own selfies long before our smartphones. He would just put a tripod up and take pictures of himself with these prostitutes and swimming in the pool and such. So he just wasn't a good person.
In the months leading up to Lita's murder, one of James' affairs had apparently become serious.
He became sort of like a couple with this Asian woman, Suki, who then became his date.
Suki and Sullivan began a relationship while he was still married to Lita. And after he and Lita separated, he began pursuing Suki seriously.
For Lita, it was the final straw. Soon after, she filed for divorce, but was gunned down before it could be finalized.
Lita came back to Atlanta and was living in Buckhead. And on the day of her murder, on January 16, 1987, there was a hearing scheduled in Fulton County Superior Court at 2 p.m. where the judge was going to make a final decision on their divorce. Lita had sought to invalidate the terms of their prenuptial agreement and was seeking a settlement. So that's what was on the table on the day that she was murdered.
The timing is incredibly suspicious, but James insists he had nothing to do with his wife's death. He and Lita signed a prenuptial agreement before their wedding 10 years prior, which means he had no financial motive. He thinks Lita was killed because she was living a dangerous double life of her own.
When Lita was killed, what his attorney and Jim made the public believe was that she was in drugs, that it was a drug deal, that it was an old boyfriend that got mad. They tried to ruin Lita's reputation.
Their angle was that it was drug dealers that did it, that she was involved with drugs, and that Jim Sullivan had nothing to do with it.
To Lita's loved ones, the idea that she could have been involved with drugs is ridiculous.
Oh my gosh, Lita didn't even hardly drink. She never did drugs. No.
The accusation adds to the tabloid nature of the story and earns James some new support.
Here in Palm Beach, they didn't really know Lita. They didn't know who her family was, so they basically came to his defense because they didn't know any better. Everything in the news that was printed and on television was that it was her fault. I mean, that's what happens to women. Even after we're dead, we got to prove that we're a nice person.
The media frenzy over the case winds up producing a new lead. Investigators get a tip about 3 suspicious men spotted at a motel near Lita's townhouse the day she was murdered.
They were able to track the killers back to this Howard Johnson motel that they had been in the day before.
And there's witnesses see 3 guys acting weird and getting in a car. It was a rental car, I think. And, they went to the flower store.
When investigators show the motel tipster the composite sketch, it's a match. On the hotel registry, they discover the 3 men had used fake names. However, phone records indicate they made several phone calls. All of them were to a number in Palm Beach, Florida.
They were in Howard Johnson's hotel room, 302, and there was a phone call from that hotel room to Jim Sullivan's house in Palm Beach. And the duration of the call was like 2 minutes or something.
It's enough to convince detectives that James Sullivan has been lying to them about his involvement in his wife's murder. But they still need proof.
It was a circumstantial evidence case. Jim Sullivan didn't pull the trigger. He was hundreds of miles away in Palm Beach at the time.
Coming up, investigators get some help from an unexpected source.
They're getting divorced down here. She tells these stories like, I'm afraid of the guy.
Four months into their investigation, Atlanta police are zeroing in on a suspect in the murder of Lita Sullivan. They believe her estranged husband, James, may have hired a group of hitmen to kill her. James insists that their prenup means he had no motive, but detectives learn that might not have been the case.
She was trying to bust the terms of their prenuptial agreement in order to obtain more of his money that she felt that she was entitled to. He was not only adamantly opposed to it, but was very vocal in his strategy of scorched earth, that if he had to burn all of the assets before she got him, he would be willing to do that.
He didn't think he should have to share anything with Miss Sullivan through the divorce and was trying to preserve his wealth by having her murdered.
If the court ruled in Lita's favor, James stood to lose over $1 million.
She wanted to keep the townhouse in Atlanta. She wanted her car, which was a little two-seater Mercedes, which was not a new car, and she wanted her jewelry. But Jim wanted the jewelry, he wanted the townhouse, and he wanted the car. He wanted everything. He wanted her to walk away with nothing. It was worth $1 million, the settlement. That's all it was.
However, motive is only one piece of the puzzle. Other than a few suspicious phone calls, investigators don't have any solid evidence linking him to the crime. And as the months go on, the chances of finding that proof grow further out of reach.
The Atlanta Police Department in 1987 looked high, looked low, did everything they could in an attempt to solve Lita's murder and could not. They couldn't piece it together.
It was nothing that the Atlanta police did or didn't do that caused the case to go cold. I mean, I think they did an excellent job from the onset. There was a lot of obstacles, and there was no cooperation, obviously, from Jim Sullivan.
In the meantime, James has continued to climb the social ladder in Palm Beach.
After Lita was murdered, he was free, of course. So not only did he not have to pay Lita anything after she was murdered, but he was free to marry Suki.
She was enamored with him because he came across the same way he did with Lita, charming.
But in 1989, a routine traffic stop would cause him to lose it all.
He was driving the car, it was the Mercedes or the Rolls Royce, whatever, but he was involved in a minor traffic accident.
He's not supposed to be driving. He doesn't have a license. The tag's on his car. He's so cheap he doesn't even keep the tags current. So he gets a couple citations. He goes to court. The cop doesn't show up. So he gets Suki to testify, Your Honor, I was driving. So they threw the case out. Well, wouldn't you know, a Palm Beach Post reporter, he's in court that day because he's kind of watching Sullivan too. He gets back to his office and calls the police officer and says, hey, I know you didn't come to court today, but Sullivan had his wife testify that she was driving. He had her stand up in court and swear under oath. Now the cop's hot. So he goes to the state attorney and they start this investigation.
They wind up convicting him of perjury, and he takes a plea, and he was restricted to house arrest for, I guess, a year.
At the same time, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has obtained a warrant to search James and Suki's home.
GBI came down here. He sees a gun in the house. He gets charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon.
They found 4 weapons. One was sort of shotgun, which he was not permitted to have while under house arrest.
The gun charge, as well as Suki's false testimony, gives detectives some new leverage in their murder investigation.
They charged Suki with perjury. Now she's freaking out because she's got a felony charge, and so now they're really split.
She just felt like that was just wrong. She didn't do anything, and he was the one that should, face the court.
In 1990, Suki files for divorce and agrees to testify against James. She winds up giving investigators more than they could have ever hoped for.
She says Sullivan basically didn't confess, but said Lita's murder is good for us, which is kind of unusual, you know, telling a woman, my wife was murdered, and it's going to be good for us.
That exclamation caused an intense national publicity.
With Suki's sworn testimony, prosecutors have what they need to present their case against James Sullivan to a grand jury.
He was arrested shortly after that point.
Coming up, charging a multimillionaire with murder is one thing. Convicting him is another.
He hired big-time Washington, D.C. lawyer, and they shut us down.
Five years after the murder of Lita Sullivan, investigators have finally arrested her ex-husband James for planning the crime.
The feds had indicted Sullivan for interstate commerce for committing a crime, namely using the phones to set up this hit, murder. The main witness at the 1992 federal trial was Suki Sullivan. Suki doesn't want to take the hit for him anymore.
But as the trial begins in June of 1992, it quickly becomes clear that their case still isn't strong enough. James has hired an expensive and effective legal team who turned the testimony of his latest ex-wife into a disaster for the prosecution.
Upon cross-examination, she fell apart. They didn't have enough to really nail her, but they had enough to dirty her up really badly, that she was just out to get money from Sullivan.
She pretended that she wasn't understanding or able to read English. She pretended that she was frightened of Mr. Sullivan, and those pretensions by her turned out to be completely false, at least from the court's perspective when the court entered the final judgment.
He was acquitted by a judge. It was a directed verdict in federal court, and he was free after that and just remained at large.
Even if James did hire hitmen to get rid of Lita, it looks like he's going to get away with it. But Lita's well-connected parents decide to take matters into their own hands with a civil lawsuit.
They were looking to sue Sullivan for wrongful death. I think they were a little frustrated with the Atlanta prosecutors, and so we spoke for a while, and I said I'd be happy to take it on. I'm not a lawyer, so I got a good friend of mine who was practicing civil law at the time, Brad Morris, to take a look at it.
James doesn't seem to take the suit seriously, choosing to skip the high-priced lawyers this time.
He fired his attorney and he defended himself.
Mr. Sullivan determined that he would represent himself before the jury and argue his own defense as to why the issues brought by the estate of Lita Sullivan should not be accepted by the jury.
The move immediately backfires.
We go to court, and we really smoked the guy.
There was a judgment against Mr. Sullivan on behalf of the estate of Lita Sullivan for approximately $6 million.
While James has been found legally responsible for his wife's death, it still doesn't guarantee justice.
Lita's parents won a judgment against him, wrongful death. He never paid it. He never ever had any intention of paying 1 cent to anybody.
He was hiding money all over the place. They never collected a penny because they couldn't find it.
He was a criminal. That's how he was brought up. And he was a nasty man.
For the next several years, no criminal charges are placed for Lita's murder, and James Sullivan's notoriety continues to grow.
He always wanted to be in the newspapers, on TV, be talked about. Well, guess what? His wish came true, because now he's in the papers, he's on TV, he's being talked about, and not in a good way.
However, the national publicity would eventually provide detectives with a new lead.
Years later, I think it was America's Most Wanted, did a TV show based on the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In 1998, a woman named Belinda called the GBI and said that she had some information about the murder of Lita in Atlanta in 1987.
She's watching this show and she sees his picture and says, "Oh my God, this guy gave my ex-boyfriend a bag of cash."
She's living in Texas, hasn't seen Harwood in years. He knocks on her door and said, "Oh, I'm just passing through Texas and I thought I'd say hello." This was right after the America's Most Wanted had the Lita murders case on television. This woman had also seen that show. She is wigged out. She thinks Harwood's going to kill her.
For investigators, this cold case has suddenly heated back up.
One of the things that we all had a duty to do was to make sure that she was telling us the truth. And in order to do that, you have to corroborate and investigate every aspect of what she told us. And the GBI, they teamed back up with the Atlanta Police Department. One of the things that she told them was that Tony Harwood had met Jim Sullivan when he was working as a mover for a trucking company. So they went to that company and they were able to locate the original contract from November of 1986, where Tony Harwood, in fact, moved some furniture into Jim Sullivan's home in Palm Beach.
Investigators quickly tracked down Tony Harwood in North Carolina. To their surprise, he seems to be waiting for them.
When they knocked on the door, he said something like, "I was wondering what took you so long."
He admitted to them that he met Jim Sullivan and that Jim Sullivan had hired him to kill his estranged wife and offered to pay him $25,000 to kill Lita. He confirmed that he was in Atlanta at the time that Lita was murdered, but he denied ever pulling the trigger and instead blamed another individual. After they were able to corroborate not only what Belinda said, but what Tony Harwood said with independent evidence, contracts, phone records, other witnesses, they then issued an arrest warrant for Jim Sullivan.
He was re-indicted in Fulton County for the murder of Lita Sullivan.
In most cases, double jeopardy would prevent James from being tried again for the same crime. But it seems he's unwilling to take that chance.
When they attempted to bring him in, Jim Sullivan had already gotten word that there was a warrant for his arrest, and he fled.
He took his passports and left. He got out of the U.S.
Coming up, an international manhunt begins, with James one step ahead of investigators.
He fled from Florida to Costa Rica, and from Costa Rica, he went on a worldwide tour.
An accomplice's confession has given prosecutors another chance to convict James Sullivan. But before he can be arrested, James flees the country. The search continues for several years, but James continues to evade capture. So in 2002, the FBI tries enlisting the aid of the public.
At that time, America's Most Wanted was very popular. We used them as a very good investigative tool to assist us in trying to find people. That night that it was featured, I was there at America's Most Wanted answering phone calls. We started getting a lot of phone calls saying he's in Thailand.
Thailand police immediately placed James under arrest, but the wheels of international justice turn slowly. It takes 2 more years for James to be extradited back to the United States. In the meantime, prosecutors used the delay to prepare their case.
We did everything we could to round up the witnesses, interview the witnesses, prepare our physical evidence, make sure we had everything tested and everything investigated. We had to go about finding people and interviewing people who hadn't spoken of her murder for years, decades. Tony Harwood entered into a negotiated plea with the state of Georgia, and what he agreed to do was to serve 20 years in prison for his role in the death of Lita in exchange for testifying against Jim Sullivan at trial.
It probably prevented him from getting the death penalty.
When James arrives in 2004, his attorneys immediately file a motion to dismiss the charges. It goes all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court for a decision.
He tried to block his trial by saying double jeopardy, that the federal government had prosecuted him for this crime already and he had been acquitted, and therefore the state of Georgia could not try him for this crime. He lost that appeal to the Supreme Court.
In 2006, 19 years after Lita was assassinated, James Sullivan finally stands trial in Georgia. Although prosecutors have first-hand testimony from one of the hitmen James hired, the defense argues that there is no actual evidence he was involved.
We could never place any firearms, at least a 9mm in Harwood's possession. Never got any hits back on the shell casings. He says that, he threw it out the window for the guy. I think he said his name was Bob or something.
The defense blamed it all on Tony Harwood. Basically, Harwood is a liar, and you can't believe anything he has to say, and the state just didn't prove their case. And they're just blaming Sullivan because he's the usual suspect, the estranged ex-husband.
But the state's case proves strong enough to prevent James from escaping for a second time.
Ma'am, would you publish the verdict?
It took the jury a few hours to deliberate.
We, the jury, find the defendant, James Vincent Sullivan, guilty of malice murder.
And find Jim Sullivan guilty of Lita's murder. Then the jury affixed the penalty at life without the possibility of parole.
Everybody was elated, especially the family, all the people that worked so hard on the investigation, the Atlanta Police Department, the GBI, everybody that was involved with this.
When I heard the verdict, I thought that show-off of a man who only talked about all the places he had and he lived and the clothes he had, now is going to have to spend the rest of his life in this prison, in this beat-up old uniform.
It seems a fitting end for such a notorious social climber. The same callousness and greed that drove James to have Lita killed wound up putting him in jail for the rest of his life.
Jim killed Lita because he couldn't part with 1 cent. She was not going to get that condominium, that car, and the jewelry. It was just power. It was just power and greed. That's all. She was not going to win.
Justice was served. I'd have much rather Mr. Sullivan receive the death penalty because of what he did. But him staying in jail for the remainder of his life doesn't bring back Miss Sullivan.
And I always think of the possibilities of the woman she could have been. She would be about 68 now, I believe. What she could have done, she would have remarried, had children. I mean, that's what she wanted. She never got to fulfill all her dreams.
There may be some money out there. The best vengeance was to get that money and then give it to the McClintons to donate somewhere, because I'm sure they'd donate it. That would be the best vengeance for me anyways.
He was a beloved father working hard to provide for his family.
He was a family man. He was a good guy.
He was a very doting parent. He had settled in as a typical suburban father.
Until a cold-blooded assassin descended on a local gas station.
It was so brutal. It literally was just done with no regard for this man's life.
We had a rather big whodunit.
You got a guy with a hot temper. Who did he piss off?
The investigation would take detectives into the upper echelons of wealthy Ohio society to catch a killer out for revenge.
Are they going to retaliate against me? This is scary.
Saturday, June 16th, 2001. It's a busy weekend in the quiet Midwestern town of Akron, Ohio.
It's a suburban area, really, with these large, sprawling homes, lots of acreage. And, you know, it has its strip malls, it has its suburban communities.
It was Father's Day weekend and quite crowded. There was a lot of traffic.
Then suddenly, a shot rings out amidst the crowd of shoppers.
Emergency. I need immediate help. We have gunshot wound at BJ's Wholesale Club. He's got a gunshot wound to his face. He's bleeding profusely.
Is he conscious?
He barely.
The incident occurred at a warehouse pub at their gas station, so a public area. And here you have a person pulling up in a motorcycle and shooting one shot.
It was just like so nonchalant. It wasn't at night. It wasn't sneaky.
There were several people who witnessed it, but the person was wearing a helmet and a mask so that he could not be identified.
The assassin's target is a man sitting alone in an SUV. By the time police arrive, he is already dead. The victim is identified as 44-year-old local businessman, Jeff Zack.
When it went through my mind, I was wondering who would do something like this and hurt his family like this.
Before settling down in Akron, Jeff Zack had grown up in another Rust Belt town, Detroit, Michigan.
Jeff Zack was born in 1957, and from what I understand, he was abandoned by his birth father.
The divorce was very hard on my children. In those years, it was very unusual to get divorced, and it was just very hard.
Jeff Zack was fortunate in that his mother remarried, and he had a stepfather who was apparently quite prominent in his life and took a good deal of interest in him.
He was my firstborn child, my firstborn son. He was very smart, very vivacious, very interesting kid.
Jeff's parents encouraged him to pursue his dreams. So in his early 20s, he decided to leave his hometown behind.
Jeff Zack decided to branch out and see the world. He traveled to Israel. Most people of Jewish ancestry have automatic dual citizenship over there.
He joined the IDF, which is the army for Israel. He wanted to become a pilot, but he didn't quite qualify.
He couldn't become what he wanted to become. He had to join the Air Force and become a paratrooper for the Israeli Air Force. But he learned how to speak Hebrew fluently, plus a lot of Arabic and a lot of other languages.
But after completing his tour of duty, Jeff struggled to settle back into civilian life in the United States.
He had the kind of personality that alienated a lot of people. He could be successful at times, but he had an abrasive attitude.
He was this big, kind of in-your-face type of guy. You know, you didn't want to piss Jeff Zack off.
He was trying to be rich. He did whatever he had to do to survive.
Until one day, Jeff met the woman who would change his life forever.
Bonnie and Jeff met in Arizona. in 1986. And they fell madly in love, and they kind of just ran away together. They were quickly married afterwards.
Before long, they had a child together.
Brian was born after a few years, so they were ecstatic, and he has always been the sweetest, most darling child. And they lived in San Diego for a couple of years. And then they decided to move back to Akron. Her parents lived in Akron, and they thought they could do better there and would have family there.
They lived in a single-family dwelling in a nice area called Stowe, which is a suburb of Akron.
When I think about Jeff, I think of him as like a family man, a person I was proud to meet, and he loved his son.
He was a very doting parent. He was very involved in his son's life.
But Jeff would never get the chance to see his son grow up. Now he's been gunned down in cold blood by an unknown assailant, and Akron police want to know why.
He was a great father, and he was a husband. And he was murdered in broad daylight. It just didn't make sense.
Brian was 12 and a half when Jeffrey was murdered. So mean. Right before Father's Day.
I never just couldn't get it, on why, who would do something like this to him.
Coming up, was Jeff Zack the family man he appeared to be?
He liked to talk to women, and sometimes that got him in trouble.
"44-year-old Jeff Zack has been murdered outside a busy shopping center in the suburbs of Akron. As detectives speak to witnesses at the scene, they are stunned by the brazenness of the attack.
Mr. Zack pulled into a gas station, and an individual came up on a motorcycle, stopped, shot Mr. Zack in the face.
He did this during daylight, which is, he had a lot of nerve.
The killer had been careful to cover his tracks. Investigators managed to find only one piece of evidence.
A projectile was found at the scene about 100 yards from the vehicle that Jeff Zack was in. That was a good find, but there was nothing really to compare it with.
And although the shooting occurred in public, no one is able to provide a clear description.
The shooting happened so quickly that no one really had the time to get a good look at the perpetrator.
That person wore dark clothing and a motorcycle helmet with full darkened face mask, so the face couldn't be seen.
However, witnesses did get a good look at the killer's motorcycle.
It was a ninja-style motorcycle. They call them crotch rockets.
It was like a racing motorcycle, one that the witnesses said was built for high speed.
It was one of those bikes that you lay forward on, and it has high horsepower. It was black and white, trimmed in green, like a fluorescent or a candy apple green.
Investigators issue an alert, but without a license plate number, they know the chances of finding it are slim.
Even though this murder took place on Father's Day weekend in a crowded parking lot on a shopping day, the police really didn't have much to go on.
What do you have, really? You have this shadowy figure who pulls in, commits a murder, and drives away. Nothing else.
No one seems to have any idea who might want to kill Jeff, but his wife, Bonnie, is able to give detectives a promising lead.
Shortly before his murder, there was a phone call to the residence indicating that you have one more chance to get out of this. And Bonnie told Jeff about that phone call, and he was very nervous about it.
at the job sites, he would tell me that he was getting a phone call, and I'd be like, Jeff, just don't worry about it. Don't get stressed out. Just let's get the job done. And I never knew it would just end up to the situation that it ended up to.
We recovered that voicemail, and it was a veiled threat to Jeff Zack that he had a short time left and that he better do the right thing.
Investigators want to know, who was this mysterious caller?
She holds nothing back. She says, look, my husband, he was involved in some really shady business.
Here was a guy who had a very bad temper, who had business dealings that had gone south, numerous bad business dealings. So this was a guy who made enemies spontaneously.
He was arrogant, abrasive, and when you deal with a victim that's like that, your investigation is going to go into a bunch of different directions. You have to keep an open mind and follow up on everything.
Detectives learned that one of Jeff's bad business deals led to a heated argument in the weeks before his death.
Jeff and Bonnie's house had wind and rain damage to it, and these two independent contractors were going to repair it. Well, they took the money and then they ended up not doing the work, and Jeff was threatening to turn them over for insurance fraud. And there was exchange of words between them. One of the contractors, we thought, was the one that had threatened him. He remained a suspect up until he took him past the polygraph and was eliminated as a suspect.
When investigators asked friends and family if Jeff had problems with anyone else, one name immediately comes to mind.
He would talk about, this lady. I never knew her, but he would always talk about this certain lady.
Jeff was hardly a monogamous husband. There was a long-time affair with a local woman named Cynthia George.
Cindy George was married to a man who owned a huge restaurant.
I heard of Cynthia George and Ed George because they own Tangiers in Akron, and Tangiers is a pretty prominent place.
They were considered elite in Akron, not the average by any means.
After work, Jeff Zack, he would more or less have reasons to go over there to hang out.
But according to Bonnie, her husband was doing a lot more than just hanging out.
Jeff Zack and Bonnie Zack would be in the Tangiers, and Cynthia would walk by, and just the eye contact alone between them, you could tell there was something going on.
Bonnie was devastated. Cindy pretended to be a good friend of the family and of Jeffrey's. But we all suspected that it was an affair.
Detectives sit down with Bonnie Zack, and they have to empathize with her a little bit. I mean, this woman just lost her husband, the father of her children.
Their affair had also led to other complications.
As Bonnie described the relationship between her late husband and Cynthia George, she disclosed that not only were they lovers, they shared something else in common. They shared a love child. In fact, one of the George's children, who Ed George embraced as his own, was apparently Jeff Zack's offspring.
Coming up, did his wife's infidelity drive Ed George over the edge?
As a jilted husband, he had the motivation to have him taken out.
Detectives in Akron, Ohio have gotten their first lead in the slaying of local businessman Jeff Zack. After speaking with his widow Bonnie, investigators have ruled her out.
They found her to be relatively gracious, relatively honest, did not seem suspicious in any way.
And according to Bonnie, Jeff had been cheating on her with one of the most powerful women in the city, nightclub owner Cynthia George.
In May of 2001, right before the homicide, Bonnie found out about it. Jeff told her that he cut it off.
Could Jeff's killer be his ex-lover or her husband?
Detectives told me that they suspected Ed George as a culprit because he seemed to have a motive. His wife had a child with Jeff Zack. Maybe he felt shamed.
As investigators dig deeper into the Georges' marriage, they learn that Ed and Cynthia had always been an odd match.
Cynthia grew up in North Canton, which is south of Akron, and it's kind of a Rust Belt town.
Cynthia George had come from rather humble stock herself. She was the daughter of a coal miner, and the family struggled.
The Georges were wealthier and had the Tangiers restaurant. And I think some of the Georges felt as though Cindy was not good enough for Ed George.
The couple had first met when Cynthia auditioned to become a dancer at the Tangier in 1978. But as soon as Ed laid eyes on her, he had other plans.
Cynthia was Mrs. Ohio runner-up at one time. So here is this beautiful woman kind of gracefully walking throughout this club at night.
She was a strikingly beautiful woman, and Ed was a successful man, and the chemistry seemed to work for them.
Soon they got married. If Cynthia George was looking for a golden ticket, certainly Ed George was it. You know, when investigators look at this, they're like, well, wait a minute. Cynthia George, Ed George, very wealthy, and here's Jeff Zack. He lives in a suburban house. He does not have any money. How does it fit?
After gathering all their information, detectives quite reasonably decided to pay a visit to Cynthia George.
They began asking her questions because she's connected to this victim. You know, she's like, who, me? I've done nothing. I don't know anything.
She did admit that she knew Jeff Zack, but she wouldn't elaborate any more than that.
Cynthia George may not want to talk, but her husband has a lot to say about Jeff Zack.
Ed George wasn't home when investigators first questioned Cynthia. So they go to Ed, and they want to question him. Ed tells this kind of contradictory story to what his wife had told.
He described Jeff Zack as something of a menace. He said that Jeff Zack had been phoning the house, he'd been calling the house and hanging up. To Ed George, he wasn't just a nuisance. Jeff Zack was a harasser.
Now we have two different stories from a married couple who both know the victim. Wow. You got to look further into that.
To find out whether Bonnie Zack's claim about the Georges' child is true, they request a court order for a DNA sample.
Police wanted to confirm whether this tale about Jeff Zack fathering a child with Cynthia George was indeed true. I mean, at this point, you know, they're hearing information from people, but it's basically gossip.
Cynthia and Ed George are very prominent in the community of Akron. So when this did come out regarding Jeff Zack possibly fathering a child with Cynthia, I mean, it was unbelievable. It was just mind-boggling to people.
Ultimately, police were successful in obtaining a court order to force the George's child to take a paternity test. When the test results came back, it turned out that biologically she was not Ed George's child. She was indeed Jeff Zack's child. At this point, police realized Cynthia George had been carrying around a very weighty secret.
If Ed discovered the truth, it seems plausible that he'd want to take his revenge. But investigators know that isn't the only possibility.
They're thinking, geez, either Cynthia or Ed George could have hired someone to kill Jeff Zack. Or maybe it was Cynthia George herself on that motorcycle who killed Jeff Zack. Maybe it was Ed George.
She had motive for getting rid of Jeff Zack because now there could be a custody battle, and Ed George had motive, because if he did know, maybe he was so shamed by this scandal that he wanted to get rid of Jeff Zack.
Coming up, a new suspect unexpectedly enters the picture.
Police get a call, and bang, this thing just opens wide.
Several months into the investigation of Jeff Zack's murder, Akron police are looking into millionaire couple Ed and Cynthia George and their relationship with the victim.
Cynthia and Jeff had a relationship for approximately 7 years. They even had a baby together.
However, detectives still have no hard evidence tying either of them to the crime.
Jeff Zack was a pest. He was a harasser. He was the father of one of the George's children. But there was nothing really beyond that.
Because they don't have enough evidence really to charge Cynthia or Ed George. What do? They've taken it as far as they can go.
I thought the investigation just stopped, for some reason. Then everything came out.
On the 1-year anniversary of Jeff Zack's death, the Akron Beacon Journal publishes an article about the case. It leads to the breakthrough investigators were hoping for.
Shortly after the article ran, a tipster phoned the Akron Police Department and said, "I know who the shooter is."
And that tip comes with a name. John Zaffino. John Zaffino is this kind of short, stocky guy, mustache, slick back hair, a wannabe gangster. If you're looking for a profile of a murderer, John Zaffino, he fits it. But here's a question. Why would John Zaffino murder Jeff Zack?
When investigators track down John Zaffino, he refuses to answer any questions. But his ex-wife is more than willing to talk to police.
It was just a cold case for a year. And then Christine Zaffino, who was John Zaffino's former wife, came forth and said she suspected that John Zaffino and Cindy were involved in the killing of Jeff.
He had told her things that made her suspicious. The police were investigating him.
According to Christine, John Zaffino had admitted to her that he had recently had an altercation with Jeff Zack. And she asked him straight out, "Are you the guy who shot him?" And he said something to the effect of, "Well, let's put it this way. He's going to have a hard time parting his hair from now on."
When detectives play the threatening voicemail on Jeff's answering machine, Christine is absolutely certain it's him.
She said, "No doubt about it. That is the voice of my ex-husband, John Zaffino."
But if anybody should be able to recognize his voice, it would be ex-wives.
Christine also has a good idea what his motive might have been.
Even though John Zaffino and Christine Todaro had broken up, she kept track of different occurrences in her ex's life. And she knew that he had been dating a woman who was attractive and older and had money.
And they say, "Well, do you know her name?" She says, "Yeah, I know her name. She's very popular in town. Her name's Cynthia George." So where's the common denominator? Where's the connection between John Zaffino and Jeff Zack? Well, the connection was at the Tangiers. Cynthia George.
This was not a love triangle so much as it was a lover's quadrangle. While Cynthia George was married to Ed George, she was having affairs with both Jeff Zack and police determined John Zaffino.
John was kind of a blue-collar guy. And Cindy originally was a blue-collar woman, so maybe there was this attraction there.
How much she really got deep into a relationship with John Zaffino is possibly still a question. But their relationship developed at least significantly.
At this point, Cynthia is refusing to speak with investigators and does not admit to an affair with John. But DMV records provide detectives with another piece of evidence.
They discovered that, lo and behold, a month before Jeff Zach's death, what had John Zaffino purchased? A motorcycle, and not just any motorcycle, a black and lime green motorcycle like the one seen at the crime scene.
My captain, Beth Doherty, found the motorcycle in Pennsylvania on a publication called Cycle Trader. And that's when Mike Schaefer and I were tasked with going to recover it. We located the bike, and we learned that he had transported there at night. He was desperate to get rid of the motorcycle, and that he wanted to trade it for any car that they had on the lot.
It's enough for police to make an arrest. On September 25th, 2002, they take John Zaffino into custody.
One domino has now fallen in this murder case. But investigators know there will be others.
Coming up, did he kill Jeff Zach to keep Cynthia George to himself? Or was he a hired gun?
Investigators are saying, look, was Cynthia involved? Was Ed involved? Did they pay you to do this?
Investigators in Akron, Ohio have arrested one of Cynthia George's lovers, John Zaffino, for the murder of her other lover, Jeff Zach. But they believe there is still more to the story.
We cleared Ed George of any involvement in this, and Cindy remained a suspect, but we didn't know how much until John Zaffino became a suspect. And then the more he became a suspect, the more the involvement of Cindy was believed.
Under interrogation, John tries to deny everything.
John Zaffino says, I'm totally innocent. I had nothing to do with this. In fact, I was at a car show in Pennsylvania the day the murder occurred. So I have an alibi.
People were located that he supposedly was with and interviewed, and they didn't support his alibi as far as timing. He had enough time to do the murder and travel down there and use that as his alibi, but it didn't hold up.
His phone records proved to be even more incriminating.
Then you look at the phone records immediately after the homicide. Who does he call? He calls Cindy George.
John Zaffino talked to Cynthia George just before Jeff Zach was murdered and just after he was murdered. Now, why would he do that? He would do that for two reasons. One, to say, I'm on my way to kill him, and a second time to say, I just killed him.
Prosecutors offer John a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against Cindy, but still, he refuses to talk.
Obviously, we wanted him to cooperate. He did not do that. So there's two inferences to draw, that Cindy wasn't involved or he's loyal to Cindy and was not going to rat her out.
They could tie John Zaffino directly to the motorcycle, and they knew that his alibi was false. And so they said, all right, let's take this guy to trial.
In February of 2003, almost 2 years after the crime, John Zaffino stands trial for the murder of Jeff Zach.
Even though Cynthia George was not on trial herself, the foundation of the case revolved around Cynthia George. Cynthia George was apparently John Zaffino's motive for committing this murder.
What the prosecution presented was that Cynthia had an affair with Jeff Zach. And when it ultimately ended, Jeff Zach kind of couldn't let it go. That he kept trying to contact Cynthia. Cynthia said, this gentleman's harassing me and I would like you to take care of it. And allegedly John did.
They even put Cynthia George herself on the witness stand.
Cynthia was called as a witness to his trial.
She pleads the fifth. Why would you do that? You would do that if you had things to hide. You would do that if you thought what I say is going to get me in trouble.
For the jury, Cynthia's silence is just as incriminating as anything she could have said.
On March 11th, 2003, John Zaffino was found guilty of murder.
He was given life with, I believe, his first opportunity for a parole hearing would be 23 years later.
He's sent away forever on a murder charge. Now, what will that do to John Zaffino?
Still, John refuses to talk.
We were hoping that John Zaffino would testify against Cindy. That just never occurred.
The public sentiment by the end of 2004 was that Cynthia George was the mastermind of this murder. Everybody was talking about that.
It was horrible. And I did some interviews purposely because I wanted it out there that I felt Cindy was involved.
It isn't until the following year that investigators feel they have enough evidence to finally prosecute her.
The big break was that John Zaffino and Cynthia George were talking. There were calls from the prison to her that were recorded. And those calls started to reveal that perhaps there was a conspiracy here to commit murder, that Cynthia was involved. The prosecution believes that Cynthia George was basically paying money to John Zaffino, and John was dangling over her head with this ambiguous threat, if you will, that he was going to drop a dime on her at any moment if she didn't pay.
On January 10th, 2005, Cynthia George is placed under arrest.
Police moved in on Cynthia George as she was shopping. She was arrested very publicly in a very public place.
The reason for it was twofold. One, they wanted to make a statement to the town, to the city, that they never gave up on this case. Number two, they wanted to put fear into Cynthia, to let her know that, listen, you're not above the law.
The police called me to tell me that they had indicted Cindy and that they arrested her, and I was ecstatic.
Coming up, will Cynthia George be convicted, or will wealth and power help get her off the hook for murder?
If you got money, you can buy your way out of most of anything.
More than 4 years after Jeff Zack was killed, Akron millionaire Cynthia George stands trial for conspiracy to commit his murder.
This case attracted a lot of interest in the city of Akron.
This case had everything, really, that the public ate up. Affairs, illegitimate child, wealthy people.
Due to the widespread media coverage, Cynthia's lawyers make a surprising request.
Cindy was afraid that maybe that publicity would have affected the jury.
Rather than being tried by a jury of her peers, she decided to have a bench trial, which meant her fate would be decided by a judge.
The old adage is everybody wants a fair trial as long as it's in their favor.
On November 14th, 2005, prosecutors make their opening arguments before the judge.
The prosecution had some concerns because they didn't have really John Zaffino saying, yeah, she told me to kill him. But what they did have is they had a lot of document evidence, meaning they could show money changing hands.
When authorities accessed the financial records, they discovered that a month or so before the murder, $5,300 had come out of Cynthia George's account. And approximately $5,300 had been used to purchase the motorcycle that was used to kill Jeff Zack.
It was just too coincidental, all of the bank statements that matched what was out of Cynthia's account to the penny.
They also draw attention to the communication between Cynthia George and John Zaffino at the time of the shooting.
Remember the phone calls? The phone call before the murder and the phone call after the murder. Was that a coincidence?
I was very happy because I knew evidence was coming out against her and that she would probably be found guilty.
However, Cynthia never admits to an affair with John, and the defense argues the state's evidence is purely circumstantial.
Even though you could imply that Cynthia George may have been involved in this case, there was no concrete evidence that she was the puppeteer in all this. In fact, it was entirely possible that John Zaffino, who was a bit of a hothead, decided to kill Jeff Zack on his own.
Those records don't prove that Cynthia knew what he was going to use that motorcycle for.
On November 28th, the court reconvenes to hear the judge's decision.
Everybody reassembled in the courtroom. Cynthia George stood up, she faced the judge, and the judge said, "I have rendered my verdict."
She was found guilty. I was very satisfied.
Cynthia George was sentenced to life in prison. You can hear her family wailing in the courtroom, and it's pretty heartbreaking.
Her family became hysterical, but I, of course, was happy. I felt that justice was served.
Cynthia wastes no time in submitting an appeal.
The conviction of Cynthia George was appealed up to the 9th District Court of Appeals, alleging errors occurred at the trial court level, which caused her to be found guilty.
She hired the best appellate lawyers she could get. And, the thing is, it's very, very unlikely that an appellate court would overturn a murder conviction. So she was not facing an uphill battle. She was facing Mount Everest here.
But a year and a half later, she achieves what many believe to be impossible.
On March 21st, 2007, the charges against Cynthia George were dismissed by the Court of Appeals.
That appeal decision just really blew everybody involved in this case away. Really did.
When you read their opinion, they wanted evidence of solicitation and procure. They wanted a conversation from the state where Cindy George is asking John Zaffino to commit the murder. We did not have that. We had solely circumstantial evidence.
After her release, the George family releases a statement saying their faith had sustained them and that they are moving forward with their lives as a family.
Last I heard, Cynthia George was, living the happy, elite life with her husband and her kids, who are all grown now.
In my eyes, Cynthia George got away with murder.
It's a sentiment shared by many in the city of Akron. Many felt that a woman of wealth and privilege seemed to have taken revenge on a former lover, something Cynthia George has always denied.
Do I think the George's money, status, and standing in the community had anything to do with that verdict being overturned? Hell yeah, I do.
Cindy had the benefit of great attorneys. She got top legal help in this case.
The fact that she got out after 16 months kind of upset me, and I miss them horribly. It was horrible loss. It took a lot of years of pain and anguish. I don't think anybody suffers as much as a mother.
two outdoorsmen devoted to the same piece of land.
It was beautiful. It was like God's country.
This is Montana. Montana has a strong, strong heritage of having a firearm, protecting your life and your property.
They started really kind of butting heads. We always felt someone was going to pull the trigger.
Their feud would escalate into an armed standoff that left one of them dead.
One of them's down. We need somebody up there now.
But is it a case of self-defense or a cover-up for murder?
He said the next time you see him, you're going to see him in a body bag.
Friday, October 18th, 2013. It's a beautiful fall day in the Flathead National Forest, located near Great Falls, Montana.
It is sort of a gateway to a very desirable wilderness area that people here just love to flock to, and that would be the Rocky Mountain front.
But at 12:20 p.m., the tranquility is disturbed when Montana police receive a call from Tanny Converse, a resident of Diamond Bar X.
911, what is your emergency?
Hi, we need the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff to come up the Upper Dearborn, up Falls Creek, having a altercation with a neighbor, and he's just ranting and raving at us.
Diamond Bar X is a remote community out in the woods. It's over 2 hours away from the sheriff's office in Helena, so dispatch sends a deputy from Augusta.
But before the deputy can get to the location, Tanny calls again.
She apparently walked to a neighbor's house to call 911, and in the time that passed, the fight had escalated.
The altercation with the neighbor, there were shots fired, and one of them's down. So one of them's down. We need somebody up there now.
When the deputy finally arrives, he finds a man lying motionless near a wooden gate. On the ground beside him is a .38 caliber pistol.
The gun was found laying on the ground 6 to 10 inches from his right hand.
It looked like some sort of gunfight. He'd been shot already once in the chest and lost a lot of blood.
It took some time to get the ambulance personnel there, and they looked at him and said that he had expired.
The dead man is identified as 53-year-old Tim Newman, a longtime resident of the area.
Tim was a gentle soul. He cared for people, helped them out. He was born in California, and his dream was always to live in Montana. His family is in southern Montana, the ranchers and the cowboys, this type of thing.
In 2001, Tim Newman had finally fulfilled his lifelong dream.
He moved to the Great Falls area. He'd been married and divorced once already and had a daughter who lived in Alaska. So he was looking to make a fresh start. He found a cabin that was a bit of a fixer-upper in Diamond Bar X. The area had been named after an old dude ranch that was there before the area was developed.
Tim was drawn to the area, I think, like the rest of us. We liked the outdoors. There was a lot of opportunity up there to hunt, fish, backpack, lots of horse riding trails in the area.
Tim found work in Great Falls, where he met his second wife, Jackie, in 2003.
He was doing some electrical for my niece and her husband, and they got to chit-chatting and found out he was single and I was single, so we did phone tag for a while. And we finally met up at a neutral place, and that was the end of that story.
They had a lot in common. Jackie was also divorced with a kid, and she worked in the food service industry for the local schools.
2 weeks later, He slipped an engagement ring on my finger, and then he stayed with me. We were married that May.
Jackie also fell in love with Tim's cabin. The couple spent most of their weekends there finishing renovations.
We made a masterpiece out of it. Going up there and overlooking the valley. I mean, there's a creek down below. There's a cliff like 2 feet away. But it was like God's country. Just, oh, I can't explain the beauty of it all.
I own and build log cabins for a living, and he was a journeyman electrician. So our relationship started out primarily work-related. Didn't take long, and we became friends.
Tim was a guy that always you could count on to help out, and we were all like that. Everybody just pitched in, and a little community.
For Tim and Jackie, it was paradise. But one area in particular held a special place in Tim's heart.
Not far from Diamond Bar X is the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which is one of the most spectacular nature preserves in the country. Locals call it the Bob.
The Bob Marshall's over 1 million acres with no roads, no nothing, so you can go back in there and pretty well lose yourself. When he bought that piece of ground up there with that cabin, what he was looking for was to find a place where he could stage himself for hunting season.
All the trails and roads that led you to the national forest went through neighboring properties. And it was understood, and people enjoyed that. They liked to see their neighbors, go by and would wave and see the horseback trips heading into the mountains.
But that all changed on October 18th, 2013.
It was about a month into the hunting season. Tim and his buddy Joe Aberley were planning another hunting trip together.
Tim and I were going to go into the mountains. He had his horse, and I had mine. We had hunted a couple of weeks before in that area. There was a lot of deadfall on the trails. So before hunting season, everyone goes in their area and cleans, saws the trees out of the way.
But the trip wouldn't go as planned. Tim had been killed in an apparent gunfight, and police don't have to look very far to find the man who shot him.
They find another man at the scene who's armed as well. He says he owns the property on the other side of the fence and had every right to shoot Tim Newman.
Coming up, locked gates and death threats.
He said, I could shoot you right now, and there's a lot of places in the mountains where somebody would not be found.
"53-year-old Tim Newman has been found shot to death near Diamond Bar X in rural Montana. The news quickly spreads around the tight-knit community.
It was just devastating. I was shocked, and I just had to sit down for a few minutes and kind of wrap my head around it.
The police were still at the scene, so one of Tim's friends wound up being the one to call Jackie to let her know what happened.
He said, Tim's been shot. He's kind of breaking up, and I said, he's been shot, is he okay? And he said, no, he's not okay, he's dead. It was one of those days that you try to forget, but you never do.
It's hard for anyone to believe someone would kill a man like Tim, but police already have the shooter in custody.
His name is Joe Campbell, and his wife is the one who called 911. He claims that Tim tried to shoot him first.
Joe had a gun. He described how it happened, that he had to fire in self-defense.
He did not seem nervous or scared or upset. He seemed very concerned, but he seemed to be able to tell his story in a coherent, cohesive manner.
67-year-old Joe Campbell and his wife Tanny are also longtime residents of Diamond Bar X.
Joe moved into the area in the late 90s. He bought a piece of property like the rest of us did. He built a cabin on it. It did become his full-time residence.
He had worked for the Forest Service in Colorado, then left that job and came up to Montana and bought into that area.
Much like the Newmans, Joe and Tanny had immediately fallen in love with the area.
They walked up the mountain and hiked and horseback ride, and we used to see him back there, and we were cordial.
Joe loved the area so much, in fact, that he began purchasing as much of it as he could.
When the original owner that developed the Diamond Over X passed away, Campbell and another resident bought the remaining property. This property is worth millions.
He ended up owning approximately 300 acres at that point, and it was scattered throughout the development, between the development and the forest.
After that, Joe's attitude towards his neighbors seemed to change.
When he got the 300 acres, he was deciding he was going to limit people's access in and out of the forest.
There was a lot of Forest Service land, but to get to that, you had to cross Campbell's land. And that was a contention between the neighbors if they wanted to enjoy the public land. Joe Campbell claimed that they were trespassing on land that he bought.
Some neighbors fired back, calling the police to complain about Joe, and that's when he decided to up the ante.
Joe Campbell began to put padlocks and gates on places that didn't have padlocks and gates.
Joe's tactics made an enemy out of one neighbor in particular, Tim Newman.
Tim was upset about that because we used to just ride out there anytime, and we'd go for miles on the horses and see all the falls.
He felt that they had a historical easement, that they had the right to enjoy unfettered access to those areas to get to the public land.
Tim wasn't going to let Joe win without a fight.
Tim started cutting locks that Joe was putting up on gates to keep people out.
Tim was flexing his muscles by cutting the gate, saying, I'm not going to go through the legal avenues.
Joe then retaliated by pressing charges against Tim.
We began to issue citations to Tim Newman for cutting those locks and the vandalism.
Tim pleaded not guilty, and the charges were later dismissed. That should have been the end of it, but Tim kept doing it, and that turned out to be a big mistake.
Joe definitely was a bully, and I think Tim was poking the bear, so to speak. I think he pushed him.
Joe tells detectives that the feud had continued for over 8 months, but things finally came to a head after he caught Tim trying to cut another one of his locks earlier that day.
Joe and his wife were out for a walk when they saw Tim with a pair of bolt cutters. He told him to stop.
Mr. Campbell had said that Mr. Newman had been taunting Mr. Campbell and Mr. Campbell's wife. He told her to call 911.
After Tanny leaves to go find a phone, things got even more heated. They were yelling back and forth at each other, and then it happened.
The story that Joe gave to the sheriff initially was that Tim had gone for his gun and that Joe had drawn his from his holster up and fired and shot Tim. He had started to roll over to shoot him, and that he had shot him the second time in the back.
It was self-defense. He felt that his life was in danger.
Given the history between the two of them and the charges against Tim, the shooting looked completely justified.
It did initially make sense to all of us who were investigating. The facts that Joe gave us looked plausible.
Coming up, investigators discover there is more to the story than meets the eye.
Joe Campbell had threatened Tim several times.
He wanted to become king of the mountain, and he was going to achieve that any way he could.
A feud over land rights in the Montana wilderness has left 53-year-old Tim Newman dead. So far, it looks like the man who shot him, 67-year-old Joe Campbell, was acting in self-defense.
We investigated the scene. We looked for the bullets. We took measurements. We photographed it, all of those kind of things.
They found a gun near Tim's body and bolt cutters by the fence, which was in line with the story Joe had told police. He seemed to have acted in accordance with Montana's Stand Your Ground laws.
The Stand Your Ground law is that you can defend your property if someone is what you think is going to cause bodily harm.
After detectives questioned Joe at the scene, they let him go. But not everyone is convinced he is telling the truth.
We were expecting he'd be arrested immediately, and he wasn't. And we were all very upset.
Tim wasn't the only one Joe had disagreements with. Over the years, he had several run-ins with other Diamond Bar ex-residents as well.
The neighbors and myself were worried that this guy did it once, he could do it twice.
Residents tell police that Joe Campbell had been using threats and intimidation to keep people off his land for years.
This was a community. They got along well. But when Joe Campbell got there, he just decided that there was a new sheriff in town and he was going to rule the roost.
He wanted to become king of the mountain, and he was going to achieve that any way he could. He pulled guns on people. He bullied people. He was just the kind of a guy that nobody wanted to be a friend with.
Tim's friend Joe Aberly tells investigators that he and his daughter had previously experienced Joe's violent streak firsthand.
We were riding a regular trail we always ride that would take us in front of Campbell's house or past his house, and he came out and challenged us with a shotgun and says, "You're not going past here." And I says, "Yes, I am." And my daughter says, "Dad, stop, he's going to shoot you in the back."
Joe did tell him, "I could shoot you right now, and there's a lot of places in the mountains where somebody would not be found."
Campbell came out with this big, actually they call it a sweeper shotgun that you'd use for mob control or slaughtering people. And that's what Campbell presented and stopped these people from going in there.
But Tim Newman is the one who bore the brunt of Joe's animosity.
Joe Campbell had threatened Tim several times to his face and to other people. He threatened to kill him because he was crossing his land.
Tim told me that Mr. Campbell had drawn a weapon on him.
It may have started out with some type of bullying before he actually started pulling out pistols, but this has been going on for several years.
At the time, local police had tried to broker a peace between the two men, but there was only so much they could do.
Confronting people with a gun and behaving in a aggressive manner, that was our business. But as far as who had the right to go on the land, that's something that we could not solve.
We wrote letters saying we were concerned for everyone's safety up there.
We had 10 or 12 families involved in the original lawsuit. Every family put in X amount of dollars, and we gave it to the attorney to research deed access and prescriptive easements.
Unfortunately, a legal battle with a wealthy landowner proved too costly to continue.
Tim and a couple of the other neighbors decided they had had enough as far as the monetary part of it was, and said they were going to pursue other avenues.
Tim decided to cut the locks so he would get charged with trespassing and the case would go to court. Of course, that only made things worse.
The more that Tim Newman asserted his rights for the historical easement, the more that Joe Campbell became aggressive.
We always were concerned that it was going to escalate, and we always felt someone was going to pull the trigger.
Joe and Tim had finally been assigned a date to face each other in court, but it never took place.
The state prosecutor decided it was a civil case and the charges against him were dropped. The other residents felt like that was the final straw for Joe Campbell.
So on the morning of October 18th, Joe's neighbors believed he decided to take matters into his own hands.
Tim and his friend were out on the trails clearing brush for their hunting trip, and that's when Joe Campbell showed up.
Tim looked out there, and he said, "Oh, it's Campbell." He said, "I want to go talk to him a minute."
Tim knew that the gate was locked up above, and that was an access that Tim had been using and was upset that the lock was back on it. They had words.
He came back just within half a minute or so, very fast, and very distressed, and Tim was. And I says, "What happened?" And he says, "Well, Joe threatened to kill me again."
A couple of hours later, Tim Newman was dead.
So had Joe really shot Tim in self-defense, or had he finally made good on his threats?
Coming up, autopsy results hint at a possible cover-up.
There are several things that just don't add up.
Police investigating the shooting death of Tim Newman have already questioned and released his longtime rival, Joe Campbell. But given the pair's ongoing dispute, they're no longer certain it was in self-defense.
It did not make sense to hear that Tim would have pulled a gun on Joe by any means. I definitely would have expected it the other way around.
Joe had already made threats multiple times.
I knew at that time that Joe Campbell murdered Tim.
Unfortunately, preliminary evidence appears to support Joe's account of the shooting.
There wasn't anything to dispute what Joe said. So Montana does have a law of stand your ground.
All the shooter has to do is say, "I was threatened," and say that Tim Newman pulled his weapon.
But there is one minor detail that doesn't fit.
Tim's hunting partner, Joe Aberley, told police that he was saddling their horses when he heard 2 gunshots. He and another neighbor, Mike Dunnington, ran over there and found Tim lying in front of the gate. His gun was on the ground beside him, but they immediately noticed something strange.
I says, "Mike, that gun is laying in front of Tim's right head." "Yeah, I see it, I see it." I said, "Listen, you know Tim is left-handed."
The gun was on his right side. I saw it there. He's left-handed. Now, I doubt if he was doing a cross draw.
If you're going to shoot a weapon, you want to be able to aim that weapon. So, no, it just wasn't logical.
So how did Tim's gun wind up in the wrong hand?
I do think that there's a good chance that that gun was placed there.
The medical examiner's report indicates another problem with Campbell's version of events.
In his first statement to police, Joe said that when Tim drew his gun, he shot him in the chest. He said that Tim had fallen to the ground and then attempted to roll over and fire his weapon, and that's when Joe shot him in the back. But the wounds didn't exactly support that. The autopsy showed that Tim had been shot twice. One bullet grazed him in the hand and then went through his shoulder. The other severed his spine, and that was the shot that killed him. And based on the medical examiner's report, that was also probably the first shot fired.
Was Campbell lying? Or had the 67-year-old simply misremembered what happened in the heat of the moment? On October 28th, 10 days after the shooting, investigators bring Joe Campbell in for a second interview. Campbell sticks by his story, insisting that Newman was the aggressor, both in their feud and on the day of the shooting.
Mr. Newman was following him on an ATV and taunting them. And they had made efforts to avoid Mr. Newman, but it persisted. And then they came to the fence where the shootings took place. He talked about feeling threatened, that he felt his life was in danger.
It is his land. He is defending his property. This is Montana. Montana has a strong, strong heritage of having a firearm, protecting your life and your property with a firearm.
Detectives confront Campbell with the discrepancies between his story and the autopsy findings. But he has a simple explanation.
Joe reenacts the whole shooting for them. He shows them how Tim spun around and fell to the ground face first and then pushed himself up with his hands and elbows. He says when Tim tried to get up, he shot him in the back, causing Tim to roll down the hill, exposing his gun. Joe then adds another interesting detail.
As Mr. Newman lay there, he looked up and said, "You shouldn't have done that, Joe," after he was shot, which I thought was a very interesting thing to offer.
To determine what really happened, the sheriff's department will need to call in a forensics expert to reconstruct the shooting.
We weren't seeing any progress. So the delay was very hard. They couldn't tell us a lot. They just said, "Be patient, we have work to do."
Oh, that was so frustrating, and I had contact with the detective almost every day, just, why haven't they gotten him? Why haven't they gotten him? And she said, we have to dot our I's and cross our T's before we can actually make an arrest.
But before that can happen, the investigation suffers an unexpected setback.
A snowstorm came in and they weren't able to access the area for several months until the snow receded.
There's nothing anyone can do at that point but wait.
Coming up, beneath the snow, the truth lies waiting to be discovered.
The story we were told didn't match the forensics.
His legs were spread as if he were running when the bullet hit him.
It's May of 2014. 7 months have passed since the death of Tim Newman, and his friends are still reeling from the loss.
This had happened to a peaceful area where the neighbors were supposed to get along. It was consuming. It consumed everybody's mindset and their conversations.
Especially since the man who shot him, Joe Campbell, has yet to be charged with a crime.
He'd been free walking around after, shooting somebody. The community was devastated by it, but he was no big deal. Today's another day.
We were concerned to go to our property. You were always looking over your shoulder.
Joe would be standing up on the hill, looking down on us working, and he'd be standing up there with a rifle in his hands.
The community began to have unrest because there was no resolution to what they felt we should be doing.
Winter snowstorms had put a hold on the investigation, but with the spring thaw came a chance to revisit the scene of the shooting.
So far, they only had Joe's version of what happened, and the medical examiner's findings didn't exactly line up. They had to go back to the area to find out what really happened.
We had a forensic scientist look at it, analyzed where those bullets entered Tim Newman's body.
The scientist's name is William Schneck. He's a crime scene investigator with the Washington State Crime Lab. Using a mannequin and other specialized forensic tools, he attempts to recreate the shooting based on the evidence gathered so far.
According to Joe Campbell, he shot Tim first in the chest and then in the back. But the nature of Tim's injuries and the position of his body indicated exactly the opposite. Joe said the first shot spun Tim around, but the trajectory of the wounds didn't line up that way.
In fact, Schneck is able to determine that Tim Newman was running away from Joe Campbell when he shot him.
Tim was laying downhill from the gate. Tim's left hand was back, his right hand was forward, and his legs were spread as if he were running when the bullet hit him.
The first shot would have put Tim Newman down. It was in the spine and made him go down. The second shot went in through the shoulder, and you could take the stick or line them up and show where he was when he got shot.
The shooting reconstruction contradicts Joe Campbell's story in other ways, too.
If Tim had been crouched by the gate with his bolt cutters when he went for his gun, like Campbell said, he probably would have dropped them right there. But that's not where police found them.
The story we were told didn't match the forensics of what we now know.
On June 23, 2014, prosecutors filed charges against Joe Campbell. Along with the forensic evidence, they cite Joe's history of conflicts with his neighbors, especially Tim Newman.
The threats against Tim continued right up to his death. In fact, days before the shooting, Joe had made it clear he intended to kill him because the court had dropped the vandalism charges.
Joe Campbell called the judge and said, the next time you see Tim Newman, you're going to see him in a body bag.
Between all of that, the autopsy, and the forensic expert, they have a pretty solid case for murder.
It wasn't how Joe Campbell said it had happened. It wasn't a matter of self-defense, but it's up to a jury to decide.
Later that day, police arrest 68-year-old Joe Campbell for first-degree murder.
He was cooperative. He didn't fight. We had been at this for quite some time. I believe he knew that this day was coming.
One of the county attorneys called me and said they're going to arrest Campbell. And I says, thank you. It was a great relief to all of us.
It was one of the happiest days of my life.
At his arraignment, Joe pleads not guilty. The defense negotiates for his release pending trial. Instead, the judge sets his bond at $1 million.
Joe's lawyers were able to negotiate a lower bond of $300,000 using his house, valued at $680,000, as collateral.
The trial is set for November, a year after Tim Newman's death. But justice would have to wait.
It's taken them months to put together the evidence against Joe Campbell and even more time to bring the case to trial. They missed the November date, and then Joe's legal team changed, which delayed it for another year.
Coming up, Joe Campbell finally stands trial, but will a jury find him guilty?
We knew it was going to be a tough case to prove.
After numerous delays, Joe Campbell finally stands trial on February 15, 2016. More than 2 years after he shot and killed his neighbor, Tim Newman. Joe has already pled not guilty under Montana's Stand Your Ground laws, but prosecutors argue that the evidence proves he was not acting in self-defense.
The prosecution tried to portray Mr. Campbell as somebody who was very angry. They had brought up several witnesses who had said they'd had run-ins with Mr. Campbell over the years. And they also said that there was never these problems before Mr. Campbell arrived on the property.
It wasn't just a deal where they got into a heated argument and pulled guns on each other. This was years in the build-up. They didn't like each other very well, and they had other confrontations. And Joe had made comments to other neighbors and people that he was going to do these things to Tim, and he was able to carry it out.
Their star witness is forensic scientist William Schneck.
It was Schneck who reconstructed the shooting scene, confirming what the autopsy had found, which was that the first and fatal shot to Tim Newman was in the back. The placement of the body and Tim's gun being in the wrong hand, the prosecution argued, all added up to murder. Campbell shot Newman as he was turned away and then staged the scene to make it look like self-defense.
The best evidence against Joe Campbell was a forensic pathology report that showed, I believe, that it was beyond a shadow of a doubt how it really happened.
But the defense has its own expert, Dr. Vincent DeMeo, who lays out a different theory.
The defense expert says it's perfectly plausible that Tim could have been falling or jumping backwards when the first shot hit him in the hand and chest, followed by the second shot that hit him in the back.
He said, well, Tim was leaning backwards. But they said to lean that far backwards, you couldn't possibly stand on 2 feet, you'd fall over backwards. It didn't matter what they said. It didn't work.
Hoping the two experts might cancel each other out, the defense calls on Joe Campbell to tell his story in his own words.
He was emotional on the stand, describing how terrified he was in the moment that Tim reached for his gun, but he had to protect himself.
He's defending his land. He has someone who says that they can trespass and that he is using a firearm to protect his ground.
The crying, I thought, you lying SOB, you dirty SOB, all the bad things you can think. That was a most blatant lie.
I never really quite knew if the tears were real, but I think he came across as credible, and he only has to come across as credible to 1 or 2 people.
On March 3rd, after a 3-week trial, the case goes to the jury.
Well, I thought the prosecution had a very good case. We were cautiously optimistic that he'd be found guilty.
But the jury doesn't agree.
They deliberated for 13 hours, and then they came back and told the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked.
I was with my wife and Tim's wife, and we just couldn't believe it.
When the jury was polled, they felt like it was a negligent homicide. They weren't comfortable going with the homicide because they felt there were some mitigating factors. The defense had done a good job at creating some doubt.
Now the state had to determine whether they would pursue a retrial or drop the case.
The detective asked me, do you want to retry this case? What do you think? And I said, yes, I do. Because I honestly thought we had him this time.
The state decided they would retry him, and so they geared up to do that.
The second trial would never take place.
Joe Campbell agreed to plead no contest to a charge of negligent homicide. It carries a 20-year sentence, but that sentence was suspended as long as Joe agreed to certain stipulations.
He would have to stay 10 miles away from Falls Creek. He could no longer carry a firearm, I believe, and also he was to sell his property at the site.
He was banished from the land that he killed a man over. For the 20 years that he's on probation, he can't come within 10 miles of that property.
Joe Campbell's reign of terror may be over, but the outcome offers little consolation to friends and family of the victim.
Some of the people who are on Tim Newman's side felt that that wasn't enough, but that was beyond our control. There was people that felt that Joe Campbell shouldn't have got anything, but I believe we did the right thing.
I believe Campbell has no conscience. He had no remorse whatsoever. He'll be facing his God someday.
We think about Tim a lot, especially during hunting season. It's a little bit of a melancholy feeling.
I know he's rusty now, and I'll meet him up there one of these days, probably sooner than I think. Time flies.